If you think back to the masterminds of modern culture, Marx, Darwin, Freud, the Einstein who wrote the early seminal papers on relativity, these men were not professors.
Even today, some of our most creative thinkers come from outside the academic community. And as outsiders, many receive little recognition. A lot of us believe that the university has a monopoly on knowledge. According to some, that myth can hurt us. I'm Barbara Shellstraight for Options in Education, with a look at independent scholars, people who quietly toil away, not for money or fame, but simply because of a spark inside them. Ron Gross studies independent scholarship in this country. He says the need for encouraging it has never been greater.
The job market for college professors now is dismal in a great many fields. Many fields are tenured up. There are simply, statistically speaking, no openings going to be available over the next 5 or 6 years, which means that people coming out of graduate school in those fields, English, history, philosophy, if they're going to continue to study and do research, will have to do it outside of academe. But I think the fast pace of society today, what Alvin Toffler calls future shock, calls for widespread independent scholarship. It's been pointed out by social scientists that the university has not been the leader in exploring the key problems that we faced in this country over the last 20 or 30 years. If you think back to poverty in the 50s, when Michael Harrington exposed the fact that this was not an affluent society, if you think of the origin of the women's movement in Betty Friedan's book, that really revealed sexism as a problem that we had not recognized or faced. In fact, when she wrote that book, she called it the problem without a name, because she couldn't find any literature deriving from academic social science on the problem. If you think of ecology, which Rachel Carson, a non-university, non-professor person, launched, if you think even of nuclear disarmament today, none of these problems were even identified, let alone explored by university-based investigators until they were revealed and brought to widespread public attention by independent researchers and investigators.
So you're arguing that not only would independent scholars be more able to do research in some rather obscure thing just because it interests them, but that they're more able to do to work on practical problems.
I think I've noticed a definite intriguing tendency on the part of independent scholars to work on problems that seem to have a human relevance. It was illuminated for me by a comment by the head of the Audubon Society, who said that you can't know as much about the birds as our members do without beginning to care about what happens to them. So I begin to connect the pursuit of knowledge for the love of it with a kind of caring attitude toward the subjects of that knowledge that is sometimes absent from academic research. Since academic research is often dictated by the needs of a discipline or the needs of an institution or the demands of a department for certain kinds of research. So I very frequently find that independent scholars choose their research from something growing out of their lives or our lives, and that they then have a real impulse to feed it back in a useful, beneficial way.
Ron Gross, head of the Independent Scholarship Project and author of the soon-to-be-released Independent Scholars Handbook. It's not easy to depart from traditional institutions and traditional ways of thinking. Buckminster Fuller, one of the better-known independent scholars and inventor of the geodesic dome, says he always saw things a little differently from others, but he tried to fit into the mold, tried unsuccessfully. He got kicked out of Harvard, failed at a business venture, and by the age of 32, considered suicide.
I had decided that I was such a mess in the world of business that I'd never be a success there. And it was a time when our second child had just been born. Our first child was born just the end of World War I. She caught flu, infantile paralysis, spinal meningitis, and she died on her 4th birthday. And 5 years later, just the time I lost all my friends' money, and I was really feeling enormously badly about that, our second child was born absolutely healthy. So here was a darling wife and a child, and I'm just in disgrace, and I was convinced that I'm going to be more of a disgrace, so I better get myself out of the way. My mother and my wife's family are not rich, but they probably can get on better, and the city won't be a disgrace to my darling new child and my wife. So I literally went to Lake Michigan to commit suicide, jump in. But I said, all through your, up to now, I was 32. You have, time and again, you've been thinking certain things, but the society wasn't thinking it, and you turned out to be right. But I've been brought up at my mother, my father died when I was very young, and my mother would say, darling, never mind what you think, listen, darling, we're trying to teach you. And they kept telling me that at school, so I was brought up with the idea that my thinking was something very unreliable, and because I knew my mother loved me, I did everything I could to pay no attention to my thinking and to learn what the game was. And so I really had a good idea what that game was, and I decided I can't get on that game. So I then said, you're going to commit suicide, you haven't been doing your own thinking, this is the last chance you're going to get to do your own thinking. So let's do some thinking. What are you throwing away if you commit suicide? I said, well, each human being is a bundle, an inventory of experiences, and my experiences have been really quite phenomenal compared to most of my contemporaries. I'd had positions of very great trust in the Navy. I really knew a very large amount about technology and how you get things going, how you get a building up, all the things you have to go through, the building departments, etc. I said, I am an inventory of experiences, and it could be, inasmuch as all humans have been born always naked, helpless, ignorant, and learn only by trial and error. It could be that we've got a point in history where the kind of experiences I have might be a link. If I throw myself away, I might throw away a link for society. So if I were to then commit myself to staying alive, but only on the basis of never working for me anymore, or working for my family or our side, but only working for humanity. If I commit myself to use my experiences for all humanity, I might be warranted and not commit suicide. But all the things I've done ever since for 54 years now, that was 1927, have been in the terms of for everybody. And that's brought me into going back into, I had to give up all the things I've been taught to believe. By the word believe, I mean accepting explanations of physical phenomena without an experiential evidence. I believed many, many things. I found that I've been brought up to believe that my community was the most important community in the world, the only really respectable one. I was brought up that the school I went to was by far the best school in the world. And Harvard was unbeatable. Everything was, I was taught to believe all these things and had all these loyalties. Because loyalties and beliefs are very much the same.
How did you get to where you began to realize that these were not necessarily truths just because you believed them?
At the moment of suicide, when I said I'm going to do my own thinking. So I said, I'm going to have to go give up all my beliefs. I've got to go on experiential evidence. I've got all this nonsense that I've been told to believe this and that. And can I unload my conditioned reflexes and do my own thinking based on actual experience? It's the only way to carry on. That's pure science. So I said, I will. I'm going to do that. It took me a couple of years to get rid of many of my conditioned reflexes. So I said, I've got to be quiet. I've got to stop myself from reflexing by saying this and that. I've got to think what the effect on other humans will be if I use a word and make a sound. So it took me 2 years to really get over it, and my wife was willing to do the talking with everybody, and there were times when I would have to talk to her, but by and large, we avoided pretty much for the first 2 years. I didn't tell her about the suicide business at all. I never even told her about it. She didn't know that many years later. And because I came back and didn't talk about what I'd been through. But she was terribly impressed with my earnestness and things I said, like I've got this conditioned reflex, I've got to get over it if I'm going to get somewhere. And I've had a lot of experience. You know, your father is a wonderful architect, and he's taught me so much. And about that time, her father came to see us in Chicago, and he said, he was the first older man ever said, Bucky, never mind what your own thinking is very sound. At this time, when I had a thought, because I've been told that my thinking didn't count, I would actually tell a lie and say, I was convinced people ought to do something, so I'd say, this great authority told me this, so I would tell a lie like that to get the people to pay attention to me. Anyway, that's where all this business starts. And this brought me back then to thinking very much about what holds its shape and so forth, and why. I realized that I'm going to give you something really very simple. I'm going to make a necklace of aluminum tubes. Each tube is 12 inches long. It's only about a half an inch in diameter. I've got a dacron cord which doesn't stretch running through it. I've got many of these tubular beads, and the thing is a very flexible necklace. So I find that the beads, the tubes are not bending to make it flex, and the tubes are not getting shorter and longer. All the flexing is in the tension cord running between them. I said, all right, I'm going to take out the tubes one by one and see what happens. If I can isolate the flexibility here. So I kept taking tubes out. I'm finally down to 5 tubes, and it's all in the steel necklace that hangs around my neck. I got down to 4 tubes, and it hung 3 down my front, 3 down my back. I said, this form, 4 tubes, is a form that the teacher went to the blackboard and said this is square. That's where I said that it only stayed square because the blackboard held it there. Otherwise, she was not being operational. Einstein learned what he did by being what he called operational. What were all the circumstances? So I took out 1 more tube after the 4. I only had 3 left. I had 3 flexible corners with 3 separate tubes, but suddenly it held its shape. And I found I couldn't take out 1 more because there wouldn't be any hole in it anymore. 2 wouldn't have a hole. So 3 was the minimum that had a hole in it, and it's the only thing that held its shape. So I said, everything in the universe that holds its shape has something to do then with this triangle.
Now, at that time, were you looking for that in particular thing, or how did you know to be messing around with it?
I'm a good experimentalist. Having been a good mechanic and been a sailor, I learned how you reduce things down to simpler, trying to isolate what is important, getting rid of the unimportance. That's a perfect good grand strategy, isn't it? See what's working. So I now found here was a triangular form. You had 3 flexible corners and had 3 separate tubes. They were absolutely independent, yet they were holding the shape. And I found that anytime anybody said, I recognize that shape, it's an oak leaf or it is a piece of coral, anytime you say I recognize the shape, it's because I must go back to triangles because nothing else holds the shape. So I'm going to stay with triangles.
Based on the theory that the triangle is the basic building block in nature, Buckminster Fuller devised a new system of math, a map projection of the world, and the geodesic domes for which he is famous. Fuller is not the first, nor will he be the last, to struggle because of his different way of seeing things.
Just consider Galileo. He knew that his findings were a complete affront to the knowledge that was accepted as the truth in his time. He knew that he was going to suffer as he did for maintaining the truth, but he said, in what might well be a motto for the independent scholar, that it is a crime and a sin to compel people to believe that which is not so. And I think when we think back on Galileo's confrontation with the church, his demand that his findings be considered and contested in open debate, that what he was really asserting was the need always for an independent sector to explore completely new areas. No institutional bureaucracy, whether it's the Church of Galileo's time or the university system of today, can or should claim that its definition of knowledge is the only true one. In fact, any codification of knowledge is perforce going to leave out some terribly important parts of reality. Modern science began outside the university in the formation of academies and societies in England and France at a time when scientific investigation was considered disreputable and not part of the world of learning. Our society does press in upon us in all kinds of ways, pressures to think the same thoughts, to think in the same style, to think about the same things, and of course to come to the same conclusions. So I believe everyone has to cultivate their personal style of truth-seeking in however small or modest a way, just to assert their own personality.
Ron Gross. When Tom Adams was a boy, he lived on a farm and developed a love of nature. He went on to become a high school English teacher. But at the age of 30, he bought a microscope and began investigating life in the ponds around him. What started out as a hobby became serious research. For 2 years, Adams visited the same pond once a week, gathering samples and categorizing what he found. He says when he started the project, he expected to find 50 to 100 life forms. He found instead 750. His results led to publication in a scholarly journal. Tom Adams became an expert by following through on something that intrigued him.
A pond is really like a zoo, but on a super scale, because if you look at a zoo has mammals in it and maybe a few reptiles, but aside from that, even though they are big and grand, it's rather limited. A pond, on the other hand, has representatives of far more things, and once you can magnify them enough to see them, they are far more fascinating than an elephant, for example, or a crocodile or something like that, because they're more diverse. They do much stranger things. Very rapidly, if you're looking in one jar of glop that you've collected, you get into the question, well, am I looking at a plant or an animal? And there are plenty of things which are partly plants, partly animals, and really not either one.
So can you just show us how you would take... Oh, here, what's this fish right here next to us?
Oh, that's just, that's a bluegill. The little area in among the algae and everything else where he has swept away all the algae, so you can see the pebbles on the bottom, is probably the nest, I should say the nest where she's going to be laying eggs and raising young, and you can see other spots like that. They look, like saucer-shaped depressions on the bottom. They're 2 or 3 feet wide. If you feel the water right here, it's very warm. The temperature of the water is probably 75 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit right here. If you go out a little bit farther and reach down, it's easily 15 degrees colder. So you've got to ask, now, which environment do I want? Do I collect one sample here and then move out 2 or 3 feet and collect a different sample down there? To give an idea of what you're collecting, if we take a jar just right here and put some of this algae into it just like this, and maybe a little bit of the sediment from the bottom, that jar will have in it at least 200 or 300 different kinds of organisms.
What was that?
Probably that was a great big bass going after something, maybe a frog or something. The pond is not always the peaceful place that you think it is, because even though this pond is only 6 acres or so, there are smallmouth bass in here which probably get up to 6 or 7 pounds. There are deer that come through here. There are occasionally ospreys that probably come in from the coast. Occasionally you see an osprey hovering over the pond, studying the water, and then he'll find a bass or maybe a catfish that looks good. And an osprey going after a catfish is about the most awkward thing you can imagine. The osprey is hovering with great difficulty about 30 or 40 feet up, and then suddenly he just lets go, and it looks and sounds like somebody just dropped a refrigerator into the water. And he hits with a great splash.
And goes underneath the water.
And goes partly underneath. There's great flapping around and splashing of water and mud, and it looks like a disaster in motion, but after a couple of seconds he flaps his way out of it, takes off, and he's got a catfish that may be a foot long or longer, and off he goes. See, ponds are full of all kinds of intrigues. Ponds are full of very specialized kinds of murder. Everything that lives in the pond is usually intent on murdering something else and eating it, and that's what happens.
What now? Now that you know all this about this pond?
Well, that's a question that means a couple of different things. The best and most basic answer to it is that I simply enjoy doing it. There doesn't have to be a particular product from it. Sometimes there is. I wrote one semi-technical paper which was translated into German and published in Germany. I've written a couple of magazine articles about ponds in this country. But the main point of an activity like this is simply to do it and enjoy doing it. It gives a feeling that you are in a more understandable world, I suppose. You can look at a pond and say, well, I have some good ideas about what's there. I understand that. I feel rather comfortable about it. I know it, you see. So it's really something to be done and enjoyed and reflected upon without necessarily any very visible product resulting from it. And I think that a lot of other independent scholars pursue things for reasons that are very similar to that. They are driven. They are not necessarily driven to produce something that the world will look at and say, hey, look at that. They are driven because they feel very much alive when they are reading 14th century French literature, or when they are doing what the rest of the world would call research on the Civil War. This is who they are. And in some ways, I suppose they are most who they are when they're doing that thing which incidentally qualifies them as independent scholars.
You have 2 children. Of course, you've got your job, and you were doing a lot of this work, I assume, nights and weekends. How did that affect the kids?
Well, first of all, I should explain that I come from a long line of hunters and fishermen, or people who have been outdoors a lot, so this affected them rather nicely. We always did things like go fishing anyhow. And to a degree, they both became involved in the somewhat nutty things that I was doing.
They would come with you to the pond sometimes?
Oh, yeah. For example, when I was working on this pond and needed to, in doing a complete inventory, you have to include things like fish and turtles. And my son, who was, I guess, about 12 or 13, had the great hardship of catching the fish and catching enough of them so that we could be sure that we had covered all the species that were there, make sure we've got one of each. And while we're at it, we recorded the sizes and where they were caught, what part of the pond, and all those things. So this is research at its best, when you can find out what's there and get some real enjoyment out of doing it.
What kind of person is it? Is everyone able to do this kind of thing?
The first characteristic is that it's someone who has fallen head over heels in love with an issue, a problem, a question, a historical person or period, with something that resonates within them, giving the feeling that this is something I was born to find out about. And I believe that very many people have within them the potential to discover that kind of hole in the world that their mind fits into, and to have that feeling that this is what I was really born to discover something new about. And I certainly believe that anybody who does discover that then has the capability, without being a professor, of becoming, and I mean this very seriously, a leading expert on whatever it is that they truly want to devote themselves to.
You know how that is just shocking to hear, because I, for one, feel as if so much is already known about almost everything. That what can I find out that people don't already know?
Well, that always reminds me of the fact that the great mining companies still rely on independent prospectors to find some of the best new sources of ore, because the land masses that need to be explored are so vast that no company's own organized effort could cover it. Similarly, professional astronomers have always and still do rely on amateurs to monitor celestial phenomena of all kinds. There simply aren't enough astronomers to make the observations required for important astronomical survey work. If you look at the sea, too, the American Littoral Society is a group of amateurs who provide absolutely essential input to the study of the coastline, so that when you think about the land, the sky, the sea, each of them is too vast for the professional cadres of explorers and investigators to satisfactorily monitor. Well, I think that's true of any major realm of the mind. David Reisman pointed out some years ago that even in sociology and the social sciences, as he put it, this country is just so big that we need vast numbers of independent, disciplined observers to provide the data and the insights to understand what's really going on in American society. So from the physical world to the social world, the reality that we confront is so vast and so complex and so quickly changing that really the contrary is true, I think, that the opportunities for independent investigation are prolific.
Ron Gross, head of the Independent Scholarship Project, sponsored by the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. Next week, we invite you to meet 8 people who have claimed a little piece of the world as theirs to investigate. By day, they are businessmen, retired people, school teachers. Mostly they're quiet people. They don't make headlines, but they have a lot to share. You can purchase a tape or transcript of this Options in Education series on independent scholars. Call this toll-free number, 800-253-0808. That's 800-253-0808. Within Michigan, call 616-471-3402. Options in Education is produced with the assistance of the Institute for Educational Leadership. Rebecca Goldfield is our producer. Our engineers are Terry Knight and Marty Cursius. I'm Barbara Shellstraight.
Support for this program comes from the National Public Radio News and Information Fund. Contributors include the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Institute of Education, the Communications Workers of America, representing 650,000 members nationwide in telecommunications and other fields, and the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation for reporting on biological resource issues. This program is a production of National Public Radio, which is solely responsible for its content. This is NPR, National Public Radio.
Here's a great idea. It hasn't been done before. Pursue it. And you look at yourself like, who, me? And yeah, you, and it's a more or less a labor of love.
He's part of a national resource, self-taught experts who devote their private time to conducting basic research in the sciences, social sciences, humanities, all areas. They're not from the university. They're businessmen, retirees, housewives, school teachers, quiet people mostly. They don't make headlines. But we'd like you to meet a few of them today. I'm Barbara Shellstraight with Part 2 of our report on independent scholars, intellectuals without the trappings.
When Emerson gave his oration on the American scholar, which is generally considered our intellectual declaration of independence, he said that in the right society, by which he meant America as he hoped it would be, the scholar would simply be man thinking. And he specifically said that we would make a great mistake if we delegated intellectual work to a particular occupational class, namely the professors. So Emerson had a vision of an America in which the scholar would be every person thinking. That meant that at another part of their lives they would be working, and at another part they would be a citizen, and at another part they would be a friend and a family person, but that in one part of each person's life they would be a thinker. Since then, we have gone in the direction that Emerson warned us against, it seems to me, of delegating intellectual work to one caste, the professoriate, and thereby brainwashing most of the rest of us to think that unless we are members of that class of professors, that we can't really be doing serious research, thinking, or writing.
Ron Gross, author of the newly released Independent Scholar's Handbook. He says today more than ever we need to encourage research outside the university. For one, because universities are increasing their use of private enterprise money for basic research, there's the possibility of conflict of interest. And besides, there aren't enough openings in the university for new PhDs eager to do research. So some problem solving will have to be done by people like John Snyder.
This is a map that I drew when I was 17 years old, called a Lambert's azimuthal equal area map of the world. And it's centered.
John Snyder has always liked maps, but after college he went to work for a pharmaceutical company as a chemical engineer. Mapping remained his hobby. And in 1976, at a mapping conference, he found out that the U.S. Geological Survey had an unsolved problem. It was trying to make maps of the Earth out of Landsat pictures, but kept getting distortions. Dr. Calvo Caresses had hoped academicians would come up with the answer. Instead, he was approached by John Snyder. Although Snyder's first work was flawed, Calvo wrote back. Snyder was encouraged.
Really, it could have been left at that, except that his response urged me to try to develop a more rigorous solution to the problem. And when I sent that back to him, he was even more enthusiastic. But it was about, all of a month or so before he started calling me at the office, and then I knew he was really serious.
What would he say?
Well, he was saying, now in connection with your latest letter, you mentioned this and this, but now what would happen if you took this approach and this approach? And so that got me to spend that evening working on that phase of the problem, and from that I found that there was an obvious answer that I hadn't thought of before.
John Snyder, who tackled a big problem on his own. Dr. Calvo Caresses was so impressed that he hired him. Joel Block, a high school science teacher from Connecticut, got involved in independent scholarship a different way. In his spare time, he took a graduate course which looked at the geological basis for biblical myth. One assignment the professor gave got Joel Block hooked. He tells reporter Faith Middleton the story.
He said, okay, what I want the class to do is to take any myth that seems to have some geological base and come up with an idea and write a paper on it. And I said, okay, Sodom and Gomorrah. Zap, Lot's wife turns to salt, and the fire and brimstone, that's about the biggest, phoniest thing I've ever heard, He said, okay, so pursue that. First thing, obviously, you have to do, if it's fire and brimstone, okay, it may be volcanic, you have to look at the geology. So I went into the geology, and then, long story short, I was doing a paper, and he said, look, we're running out of time. You're a teacher. You don't have to take the final exam if you present it. And I'm saying to myself, he's a Dutchman. I'm saying, oh, here's a foreigner. I mean, I teach for a living. I'm not going to take a 3-hour exam if I just do a few-minute pitch. I'll do it. So I, 3 3x5 cards, I went in and I presented the paper. It was taking about a half hour or so. Everybody marches into the final exam. I'm waving, like I've beaten the system. At the end of the final, he says to me, hey, that's a great idea. He's never seen it done. Why don't you put it into a paper?
What is this?
The Sodom and Gomorrah story, as being volcanic. And he said, why don't you put it into a paper, and then we can take it for an independent study. And I'm saying, he must be kidding. I am going to milk the same idea for 2 courses? Ridiculous. I'll do it. So I handed him a 12-page paper. Then he said to me, well, as long as you've gone this far, all you have to do is, now when I hear all you have to do, I know I run for cover because it's going to cost me 3 years of my life, okay? But he said that all you have to do is you beef up a little bit here, a little bit there. You're doing it on geology. You have to beef up a little bit more on the Bible. And then he said, then maybe we can get it published. It's a new idea. So I beefed up a little bit in the geology, and he said, okay, now you got to do a little more on the Bible part of it. So I beefed up a little bit more on the, and then he said, wait a minute, we need an opinion of some of other people that were in the area who are not directly concerned. So I looked around. Well, the Phoenicians were in the area, so I had to do a little research on the Phoenicians and got the Phoenician point of view of what happened to that particular time of history. So I had more beef than the Quarter Pounder. You know what I mean? It was from 12 pages up to 20 pages. I finally got through with it about 2 years later at 53 pages. And he said to me, that's terrific, but nobody will publish a 53-page thing. Cut it to 12. So I cut it. It was 3.5 years later. 3 hours I could have been out of that exam. Right? It was 3.5 years later. It did get published.
Where?
Journal of Geological Education.
So you published the paper.
Right. And the basic theory, hypothesis, was that molten material called magma came toward the surface through cracks and contacted oil and exploded out volcanic vents, which are on the ground. You can see them. Okay, the geology is there. And rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah fire and brimstone.
So this was your first experience with independent research. That was quite a lesson, wasn't it?
Yes, I thought I put something over on him. Not 3.5 years of my life. I could have been out of that exam and done.
Let's talk about the advantages. What are the advantages to staying independent?
Oh, one definite advantage, especially with some of the, in quotes, better universities. No publisher perish. I publish at my time, okay, when I want to do it, if I desire to do it. And in that sense, it's definitely a labor of love as opposed to hold my job.
Now, what about the headaches?
Oh, a number of headaches. Beside the obvious funding, the access to the university equipment, students, for example, if a professor has a large problem that he's working on, several grad students can each do an aspect of it. Okay. Another thing I don't have, something very simple, I don't have a secretary. Typing, I don't have access to the knowledge of the field, because usually those researchers are at universities and they correspond with each other, they see each other at meetings. So the new material, before it trickles down to the public, okay, is at a certain level. So I may be jumping up and down about it. Gee, here's a brand new idea, and it's already, it's not a brand new idea. In fact, they've even found the flaws in that idea. But I have no access to that type of information.
High school teacher and geologist Joel Block. He discovered another problem independent scholars face, the difficulty of getting their work noticed. Several years after Block published a paper linking the 10 plagues of Egypt with volcanic eruptions, a professor at a prestigious university published a similar theory. The professor's theory made the New York Times. Block remained obscure. Retired school principal Frank Doggett of Jacksonville, Florida, also knows how difficult it is for an independent scholar to get recognition. Today, he's a highly esteemed critic of American poet Wallace Stevens. His reputation is made. But it was tough getting started. He and his wife Dorothy talk with Steve Grad.
I wrote 2 short things on Stevens. Then I wrote a long essay, and I sent it off for 2 years to various publications, and I made the mistake of using my high school letterhead in the letter of transmittal. I found out that was a bad idea, and I was rejected. I think probably my manuscript was not even read, over and over and over again. And finally, I took the advice of my friend Aubrey Williams and sent a manuscript with just plain Frank Doggett, no relationship to a high school. And I sent it to English Literary History, a magazine published at Johns Hopkins University. And that was the first acceptance of a full-length essay. And I'd gone fishing in the St. Mary's River. It was so cold that we had to pick the ice out of the boat to throw it overboard. That's the way we bailed the boat out. I came back absolutely cold. I hadn't caught a thing. Walked in the house, and there was a letter there from Roy Harvey Pierce accepting my essay. And that was a very wonderful experience for me. And of course, I've published about 20 or 25 essays since then. And but I've never had the excitement that I had from that first acceptance.
You mentioned earlier that you wished you had been in an academic world.
Yes, it would have been a life in which I would have had been surrounded by people that were interested in books, and I would have had not been as isolated as isolated in my interests as I have been living apart from a university.
I have always felt that it was lonely not to be in there, but good for us, really and truly, because I see these young people who are intellectuals suffering through the bonehead classes they have to teach so long, so many years. And then I see them really harassed by the idea they've got to quickly publish something. They have to pick it while it's still green. They have to get it out. And I think we were lucky, Frank was lucky, to that extent, that he didn't have that terrible pressure on him. So I've never been as mad to be in a community of college people. As a matter of fact, I've met many of them with doctorates that I really didn't think they kept up much or knew very much, if you want to know the truth. And I'm sure it's a combination of what they have to do, forced on them by the institution.
I think that it's the collaboration between the two of us, I think, has been one of the most effective things as far as writing my books are concerned. In the first place, Dorothy writes poetry, and it's very good poetry too. It's not the local type of stuff, and so she has a poet's insight into the writing of poetry and the thinking of a poet. And my mind, I think, is probably more analytical, and hers is she has a great deal of intuition, and I think that the collaboration between those two types of minds has been very good for us.
Of course, we talked about Stevens all the time for years, and the children went off to college and came back and said they're still talking about the same thing. and when we quarreled about Stevens, they thought that was the only fights we ever had, when we quarreled about interpretations of poems. But what I did was I did read all the philosophy, and then we would talk about the images that were in these philosophers that were the same images that Stevens had. So sometimes, even if we woke up at night, I might say, oh, I know what Oakley's or hands means now. And then we talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I couldn't have done any critical writing of any importance if there hadn't been for this constant exchange with Dorothy. Now, we have started to write together, and if I do another book, she will write part of it too this time. We tried this last year, and we wrote an essay on Stevens that based on Stevens' explanations of certain of his own poems. And I got stuck before I was through, and so she said, well, let me see if I can't finish it. Well, she did. And it's hard to tell where my writing ends and her writing begins. In fact, you can't tell, except for the fact that the ending is the best part of the essay.
Frank and Dorothy Doggett, a couple who've lived their lives together, exploring the poetry of Wallace Stevens. Jim Cortada has just begun his work as an independent scholar. Already he's published several books on Spanish-American diplomatic relations. He would have liked to have stayed in academia, but the shrinking job market prevented it, and he went to work instead as a computer salesman at IBM.
When I was a graduate student, I found it to be a very comfortable old shoe. The amount of responsibility you have and the worries that you have are really quite limited. There's a tremendous intellectual growth and stimulation that takes place. It's in many ways a very fertile environment. I look back to those days with tremendous fondness. On the other hand, I also believe that I was living out in some planet somewhere and not close to the reality of my times.
So describe your routine. How do you write these books?
The key to the whole thing is discipline. You got to want to do it, and you got to do a little piece all the time. One of the things I've learned at IBM is how to manage time better. Just normal techniques that are used in business, which we're never exposed to in academia at all. When I sit down to determine what I'm going to write on, I usually do this with the publisher to begin with. What we'll do is we'll hammer out a topic, and we'll decide how long that book ought to be for whatever reasons. Marketability, price, depth of coverage, whatever, even down to how many chapters there'll be in the book. And then I will go home and say to myself, all right, what do I need to do specifically in order to generate a manuscript of X number of pages? I know from previous experience that it takes me 1 month to write a chapter from start to finish, regardless of the length of the chapter. So if I have a book that's got 8 chapters, then I know I have 8 months worth of work. And then what I will then do is figure out what kinds of materials I need, how long it will take, what weeks or months will be devoted to the gathering of that material, and then I will develop a schedule of events, of the 100 or 200 events, whatever I have to do in order to make that book happen. And then I just trip right on down through the list. And since it's tied to a calendar, I know whether I'm behind or ahead and can adjust my schedule accordingly. Good old-fashioned project management, as we would say in business. Well, you never do that in academia. In academia, you start a book and you go on and on and on and on until it's finished.
Don't you find that your scholarship is affected by the whole idea of marketability and having to write for a certain audience in so many chapters, and that you end up not really researching it as thoroughly as you would need to if you were just so interested in this subject you were going to find out everything about it, sort of the way you did your dissertation when you were getting your doctorate?
The potential is clearly there. I haven't noticed it yet. And the reason why is that precisely by being outside of academia, I haven't felt compelled to write on topics that were trendy from an academic point of view. I mean, for example, the in thing for a European historian to do today is to write about peasants. The least dramatic thing to write about is diplomatic history. Well, peasants are nice, but I'm not interested in writing about peasants and sociological history, so I don't write it. Now, if I were a history professor, I would have to write about peasants in order to ensure that A, the right university presses were publishing my books, and B, that I was getting my academic promotions.
But I could argue that your publisher tells you what would be nice to have next, and that's what you agree to write. So in a sense, you don't simply determine all by yourself what you're going to write.
And I'm very grateful for that, because oftentimes my publisher will force me to write on more complex topics, or encourage me to write on more complex topics than I might have had the courage to take on myself. Give you an example. I wrote my dissertation on U.S.-Spanish relations during the American Civil War. My publisher came along and said, well, why don't you do the whole shooting match from the Revolutionary War to the present? And I said, but my God, that would take several books. No, force it down to one book. Synthesize. Draw out what is important. I said, but that's harder. Do it. And it was done. Would I have done that on my own? No.
Jim Cortada of Poughkeepsie, New York. Emily Teitz is a writer. Sandra Henry is a lawyer. Neither ever expected to be doing historical research, but they are. Several years ago, their local temple asked them to prepare a program on Jewish women in history. They were surprised to find little information, so they began digging. Their research led them beyond a short presentation to a published book called Written Out of History. Emily Tights.
I'll tell you the story about Rebecca Tichtina, because I think she personifies in a way the kind of search and discovery thing that we were doing in the course of writing the book. We had read in a history of the Jewish people, a general history, that a mention was made of a woman whose name was Rebecca Tichtina. She had been the daughter of a rabbi, Tichtina, and he just mentioned in passing that she had written a book.
What year would this have been?
In the 1500s. She lived in the 1500s in the eastern part of Middle Europe. He had just mentioned that she wrote a book, but there was nothing else mentioned about her. No word about her life, about her accomplishments, about the book. And the first thing we did, of course, was go to the footnote. And the footnote gave a reference to where he had gotten that information, where that particular author got the information. So then we went back and traced down that footnote, and that footnote led us to another footnote, and finally led us to an allusion to the fact that the book she had written was, as a matter of fact, still in existence somewhere. That the printing of it, which had been done posthumously after her death, was printed in 1609 and again in 1618, and was apparently in existence somewhere. So we went through card catalogs and we didn't find her. And then we went to YIVO, which is the Yiddish Institute for Jewish Research, and they showed us a newsletter that had been put out by Dr. Schmelzer from the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, and in that newsletter he made an allusion to the fact that Rebecca Tichtina's book was in the rare book room of the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Now, so how many days have gone by, or how many phone calls or whatever?
Well, that's interesting. It's hard to say how many days went by, because all this was done basically in spare time, 1 week here, 1 week there. Sometimes we would have a block of days where we would concentrate and sometimes not, but mostly we didn't work on one thing at a time. So when we went to YIVO, we would have a list of things we did, and when we went to the Judaica, there was another list. And we did finally track down Meneket Rivka in the rare book room. Why wasn't it in the card catalog? Because the rare books are not cataloged in their card catalog. There's a special list of them which we didn't know about, because we were not at that time attached to any library or university which was familiar with that particular collection. We finally did find it. We made an appointment to go in, and we saw the book. And that was one of the most exciting experiences we had, and happened to us really towards the end of our research. So we had been talking and thinking and looking for Rebecca Tichtina's book for about a year when we finally found it, and it was shown to us, and it was really an old manuscript. It was darkened and really with age from 1609. How many years is that? And the woman who showed it to us was really loath to let us even touch it.
Had you known each other before you started working on this book?
Well, ironically enough, we lived around the corner from each other, and but we didn't really know each other. We had carpooled once, but it was the usual suburban carpool where you pick up the kid and don't even communicate with the parent. And when people learned, or when I started to talk about the research I was doing, several people take credit for it now, which we're happy that they want to. And someone said Emily was a very fine writer and very knowledgeable, and her strengths really have been in the creative writing and in her fine Hebrew background. And I have to say very proudly, almost as though she was a fourth child of mine, that she's just gotten her master's degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she's also has credits towards her PhD. But one of the most interesting things to me, something that we never would have anticipated, and why I think this whole area with the book that Ron's written on independent scholars is so fascinating, is because you grow. I mean, we are now in middle age by anybody's definition, and yet I think that academically this was probably one of the most exciting periods of our lives. And what's happened the past 4 years, is we've now developed 4 or 5 courses, the most recent of which is called Queens, Courtesans, Convent Nuns, and Commoners. And this has all grown out of our book, which we would never have anticipated 4 or 5 years ago.
Sandra Henry and Emily Tights. They, along with the other independent scholars you've met in this program, and the thousands you haven't met, play an important role in our society. But they go against the grain. Most of us tend to leave the investigation and problem-solving to someone else. Ron Gross.
Part of it's perfectly sensible. We simply can't have enough of an understanding or knowledge of all the aspects of a complicated society to make our own judgments in every area. We must rely on each other. We must rely on experts and expert organizations who we have learned to trust. But I think it's really important for each of us to know what it's like in at least one field, to know it so thoroughly and to be so confident that we can make our own judgments among the experts and among the expert opinions, because then we will be in a better position to judge in other fields whether the so-called experts are really doing a good job.
Ron Gross, whose independent scholarship project is encouraging independents to meet in local groups, to share experiences and pool resources, to support one another in a country which doesn't always support them. You can purchase a tape or transcript of this two-part Options in Education series on independent scholars. Just call this toll-free number, 800-253-0808. That's 800-253-0808. In Michigan, call 616-471-3402. Please call during regular business hours. If you'd like information on starting your own independent scholars group, or if you have comments or suggestions for us, write to National Public Radio, Education, Washington, D.C., 20036. Options in Education is produced with the assistance of the Institute for Educational Leadership. Our producer is Rebecca Goldfield. Our engineer is Sam Macarita. Some of the material for this program came from Steve Grad of member station WJCT, Jacksonville, Florida, and Faith Middleton of member station WPBH, Hartford, Connecticut. I'm Barbara Shellstraight.
Support for this program is provided by the National Public Radio News and Information Fund. Contributors to this fund include the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Institute of Education, Hewlett-Packard, worldwide manufacturer of computers and instrumentation for industry and science, and for the coverage of science, the National Science Foundation. This program is a production of National Public Radio, which is solely responsible for its content. This is NPR, National Public Radio.